Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the Battle for Azeroth Beta, they have decided to update Unholy DKs with the recent patch, and I've got to say, it looks like the talents that we were given and shown earlier actually happen to be the talents that ended up being in game. So we're going to go ahead and look over all these new abilities, test out some of this stuff, and then just kind of come to a conclusion of what we think about the overall DPS and whether or not this is going to be good for Unholy DKs in PvP situations. So let's jump into this and find out. With this new Battle for Azeroth update, I gotta say I like Blizzard's thinking here. You can't get Carpal Tunnel if you don't have any risks.
But it's alright, 'cause right now we're frozen. I wanna forget mistakes that helped me make. It's better to be broken than to break.
So let's go over some of these talents and discuss how Unholy DKs have changed. Now I've got to test out quite a few of these talents, and I'll go ahead and do further testing tonight in Mythics, pull out my big old 340 Mythic two-hander and see what we can do in terms of numbers. And we'll go ahead and kind of come up with a summarization either tomorrow or the day after what we're going on with what specs with Unholy. But as for now, we're just going to go ahead and talk over some of these things and talk about some of the things I've tested and go over a little bit of rotation with the new talents and abilities. Now for the level 56, we can either basically choose for PvE Infected Claws or Clawing Shadows. I personally like taking Clawing Shadows because it deals a little bit more DPS than it did previously in the beta, and deals quite a bit of AoE pressure in certain situations, especially with combined with Defiled. Even when I'm not running with Defiled and I'm running Epidemic, I still like taking Claw Shadows just for the enhanced amount of damage. Now for the level 57 talent, I either like taking Pestilent Pustules to grant Runic Corruption on 10% proc when bursting wounds, or I like taking Inevitable Doom, which gives me a little bit more overall DPS and procage going on there. But overall, I like the Pestilent Pustules a little bit better. As for the level 58 talents, we can choose between Bursting Swords and Ebon Fever, which Ebon Fever is obviously going to give you more overall consistency as it did in the pre-patch, and Bursting Swords is going to give you a little bit more burst with Clawing Shadows, especially with combined with Defiled, to give you more bursty damage, more upfront damage with your pulls instead of overall elongated like Ebon Fever would give. Now as for Unholy Blight, I got to test out this ability a little bit, and honestly it does an okay amount of damage, and it turns out that it is its own separate disease. It's no longer Frost Fever and Blood Fever, whatever that was, and it's completely separate from the Virulent Plague that the Unholy DKs have, completely separate from those. So in major AoE burst situations, if you're pulling half the dungeon, could be extremely effective. But other than that, since it's on a major 1-minute cooldown, and obviously it's going to be on another global minute cooldown, I wouldn't suggest using it for overall DPS as far as Mythic Pluses go. But we will take a little bit look at that in Mythic Pluses, obviously. I'll probably go through a lot of these talents, maybe even make a couple dungeon videos on it, but we'll see for the new future. As for the level 60 talents, not really affecting DPS at all. We got Asphyxiate, Death Reach, and Debilitating Infestation, which is the slow based on Outbreak. The level 75 talents are going to be more mechanical for self-healing, which is Death Pact. It heals you for 50% of your maximum health, absorbs incoming healing equal to 30% of your maximum health for 15 seconds. Kind of like a give and take to, if your healer CC'd, throw that up, you know, counter burst. And as for Wraithwalk, you now got a spec into Wraithwalk. That blows my mind that we got a spec into Wraithwalk as a DK. That just... But, I mean, we did get some interesting changes, and we also got Spell Eater, which was buffed up by 10%, now absorbs 30% more magic damage instead of 20%, and lasts 5 seconds longer if we spec into it. Fairly good for survivability. As for the level 90 talents, we got Corpse Explosion, Defile, and Epidemic, which my two favorites out of the two is Defile and Epidemic. Defile can give you a lot of AoE upfront burst, and of course is only on a 25-second cooldown now instead of I believe it was a minute cooldown, which is a fairly long cooldown for an AoE. In terms of Defile, and also Defile lets you cleave your Clawing Shadows, dealing quite a bit of AoE pressure within fights. And I believe if you have Pestilent Pustules on the other targets, it'll cause your Clawing Shadows to not only hit that one, but hit the others around it, causing major explosions, which gives you even greater peak DPS as far as burst goes. But I do like some Epidemic Ebon Fever build. As you can see, I'm not running that one currently, but I just kind of like, I switch between those two talents if I want to change my builds. But other than that, those are kind of like my go-to talents for PvE at the moment. As for the level 100 talents, I'm still testing out Unholy Frenzy. Now, it does give you quite a bit more burst, since 20% haste with dot damage is going to be a lot more damage. And obviously, if we use this ability sometime in pre-procking near the start of the fight, it's going to give us more festering wounds to deal more damage over time. And that's also going to give us a little bit more consistency and a little bit more fluentness when it comes to dealing Clawing Shadows damage after proccing Apocalypse, which has become a mainstream baseline talent. Now, you can see over here on the level 100, we also got Summon Gargoyle. They took Summon Gargoyle as a baseline talent off of the bars, and now you have to spec into it, which it also does the work that your Dark Arbiter was dealing, which you just spend runic power to increase the damage done by Gargoyle, which will be pretty good for single target bursting. But since it's a 3-minute cooldown and not a 1.25-minute cooldown, it probably won't be used nearly as much for Mythic Plus scenarios, unless, you know, it's the boss being buffed by 40% health and damage, so we'll have to kind of look there. And as for Dark Infusion, Dark Transformation lasts 5 seconds longer. Death Coil reduced the remaining cooldown of Dark Transformation by additional 3 seconds, giving you a little bit more overall Dark Transformation cooldown timer there, so he can deal a lot more AoE cleave, and of course it'll reduce the cooldown if you're running Epidemic, and just laying out a lot of that AoE Epidemic damage coming out. Fairly simple, it deals quite a bit of pressure. So we'll go ahead and go over some of these little rotations we got going on with these specs. It's really not too different from what it was before. I mean, you basically just insert Apocalypse into the opener and then proceed on with your normal DPS, unless you're running Epidemic over Defiled, which I'd say around the time that you're starved on your runes, which generally is about the time that you're going to be capping up on runic power, you're going to be dumping Epidemic out all over the target instead of using your death coils to deal quite a bit more AoE pressure than you would single target pressure with your death coils. Now, I could imagine that using Epidemic on less than 3 targets probably wouldn't end up improving your DPS, but lowering your DPS if you're using that over Death Coil. And the other nice thing is Epidemic only costs 30 runic power instead of Death Coil, which costs 40 runic power, which overall will give you a little bit more damage in the long run. But yeah, those are about the talents that I see that are kind of sticking out and impressing me. I got to test out Corpse Explosion inside dungeon scenarios. Obviously, here on the dummies, we could test it out on our own ghouls and things like that. But if we have things dying inside of the dungeon consistently, exploding around other targets, it could also help with the scenarios. But it looks like ghouls summoned by your army of dead and Apocalypse explode when they die. Maybe it is our own ghouls. Now that I'm reading that, maybe it doesn't apply to other corpses. I wish it really did. I mean, it would make a lot more sense. But if it is our only ghouls, that would make this ability rely on an 8-minute cooldown and a 1.5-minute cooldown. So, I mean, roughly every other pull, if you're proccing up Apocalypse on death, could deal quite a bit more AoE pressure. But you would have to sacrifice Defile, which I really wouldn't want to sacrifice Defile, or you'd have to sacrifice Epidemic, which is kind of like runic power AoE filler. So let's go ahead and get into some of these rotations and take a look at some of these damages. So before we start on the damage, a couple things I'm going to talk about. Obviously, I'm running the Pustulant Bursting Sword spec with Defiled. We'll switch over to the Epidemic Ebon Fever spec here in a second. But the one thing that I don't like that they did with this new patch is they put a global cooldown on Blood Fury and unused trinkets. Why would you put a global cooldown on unused trinkets and Blood Fury? Like, alone, I don't think those abilities are really worth it. I mean, if you pre-pop it running into combat, I could definitely see it being better, but just using it outside of combat, I really don't see it being very good. And I'm really kind of worried about that, because I mean, obviously, while I'm looking into something and about to go into combat, I'm gonna have to pop Dark Transformation, I'm gonna have to proc Unholy Frenzy, and then go in and either hit Defiled down on the ground and then hit Outbreak, which is like 4 abilities prep before I actually get into combat and start dealing some major DPS. So at some point in there, I either have to pre-proc these 2 abilities at the start of everything, which wastes quite a bit of time for those abilities, and trinkets, which doesn't really seem very right to me that we have to sacrifice timing on trinkets to deal maximized DPS, because using these abilities in a fight and sacrificing our damage would only benefit us during downtime during the fight, which would only benefit us at maximum timing during cooldowns. And I don't like seeing those on global cooldowns. I think that is a bit overkill for us on Battle for Azeroth, for any class really. I'm appalled, guys. I'm appalled. Right, so what we're gonna do on this target is I don't know. Am I gonna pre-proc these? I might as well throw those up before going into my Dark Transformation. And then since Dark Transformation lasts 15 seconds, Unholy Frenzy lasts 12 seconds, we'll be procking Dark Transformation first, and then Unholy Frenzy, which is going to waste about 2 seconds of our Dark Transformation, which is kind of sad. So we'll only benefit from about 13 seconds of it off an opener like this. And from there, we'll go in with 2 Festering Strikes. We'll proc Apocalypse, and then we'll go into our consistent AoE from there. And from there, we'll probably use Epidemic once we're a little bit rune starved to deal that AoE overall consistent pressure. Now, I'm not going to hold out this damage for an extremely long time, but I have seen it burst quite a bit harder than it previously was here on Battle for Azeroth with the Apocalypse added in, so that's pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and throw up these 2 abilities and the global cooldowns sucking up everything. And go ahead and pop Unholy Frenzy, pop and Defile down, and we're just going to throw out our pressure. Now we've got 5 stacks, which is pretty good, and we're just going to come out with AoE cleave pressure. Right now we're running Bursting Swords, we're not running Epidemic, so we can't go ahead and rely on that. But as you can see from our overall damage, we are just destroying damage. We're like 22k, like we never peaked that high on the previous build. Like we were not hitting anywhere near that amount of numbers. Now you notice that there is a bit of downtime happening here, and I could reprop Defile, I could go out with the other cooldowns and deal quite a bit of DPS still, and just kind of rotate that over and over again, keeping up like, you know, 14 to 15k DPS, and then probably dropping down to about 13k DPS, which is almost double the DPS that we were previously doing in the elongated pulls. Now this spec obviously is going to be benefiting more from bursty upfront damage. It's going to just be massive burst, as much as you can put into a target. Now the secondary specking that I kind of like, I wouldn't really call it secondary, because I'll probably be rocking this for the majority of the time, because I do like that it adds an extra function, an extra button to the kind of the rotation here. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of open up on it. Don't pay attention to the DPS on this too much, because it is I'd say within 2,000 to 3,000 opening DPS less than the Bursting Swords, but it's going to give you a lot more overall damage in the long run. And the fact that I don't have a couple of my other major cooldowns bursting up. But I'll go ahead and basically do the same thing as I was doing before, but just instead of death coiling, I'm going to be using Epidemic, which I need to make a macro for Epidemic to cause my little offhand goofy ghoul over here to cleave more. So we're going to go ahead and pop our major unused trinket. We're going to go and hit our Dark Transformation. We're going to go ahead and hit our Unholy Frenzy. We're going to drop D&D and apply our dots. Now I don't know if D&D is actually a good ability to proc there. I'm going to have to test that out. We're going right into the Violent Plagues. I should have hit my Clawing Shadows there for a bit more AoE, but as you can see, we're still doing roughly around 20k DPS, which is about the DPS I said we were going to do. Just a little bit less, but we're going to do a little bit more overall DPS, just in regards that our AoE pressure and our dots are going to deal quite a bit more damage over time. And again, even with this spec, we're dealing quite a bit more damage than we were than the previous build, and overall this is definitely a buff to our consistency and our major burst coming into these new patches and these new changes for Unholy in Battle for Azeroth. As for single target damage, I haven't done too many tests for single target damage, but I can already tell you just basically viewing at these, if you're running Ebon Fever consistency with Clawing Shadows and Pestilent Pusses, and for single target you probably wouldn't go Epidemic. For single target you would either go Corpse Explosion or Defiled for overall consistency, since Defiled is on a 25-second reduced cooldown, or you'd be taking the Corpse Explosion for overall opener burst DPS, and of course it's Cleave if there's multiple targets, but mainly you'll be looking towards that single target pressure, and also that applies every time you Apocalypse and your little skeletons die. So it's going to be a toss-up between those two. It'll most likely end up being Defiled, but we'll have have to see since Defiled no longer stacks mastery. As for major single target damage, we'll have to see if Summon Gargoyle actually outproduces DPS more than Unholy Frenzy. In the long run, at least at 5 to 6 minute fights, I'll have that answer probably for you within a couple of days once I test this out in higher level mythics like I've been talking about. But overall, yeah, I mean, it's looking good, guys. Unholy DK is looking solid. These major changes have definitely been more for the positive. We'll probably see some balancing, maybe a few more changes with Unholy as they tweak some things, because obviously after a major revamp, there's going to be a lot of tweaking going on, and a lot of changes still happening with current Unholy DK. But I'm excited to see these things going on. Like, this is good. Unholy DK has an extra button we can use for some major AoE. We're going to get a little bit more overall consistency, or we're going to get a little bit more proc damage if that's what we want. And of course, it seems we can go a little bit harder into some single target and different builds. I'm excited to see what other people come up with when testing out these builds. Obviously, this is kind of my idea. What I like doing with the Unholy DK is just really laying out those dot damages and relying on Epidemic, because I've been really excited to try that out, and I'm really excited to try it out when there's, like, you know, 10 to 15 targets, because that's going to be some insane AoE pressure coming out for Unholy DKs at the moment. So the big question is, was this a nerf or was this a buff to Unholy DKs in Battle for Azeroth? In my opinion, in AoE situations, it was quite the buff. Now, as for single target situations, we are going to have to do a bit more testing out, because I believe at least with Unholy Frenzy, the single target consistency is not going to be the greatest. It may actually be close to on par from what it was before, which should still be quite a bit more than a lot of other classes currently. But obviously I could sacrifice Unholy Frenzy for Summon Gargoyle to increase my single target by quite a bit, which would bring it up, I'd say, by at least 5 to 6k, bring our single target pressure burst to maybe 15, 16k, maybe 17, 18k if you get lucky. But overall, the AoE is insane that they've managed to buff us up to, and the single target pressure is not bad either, especially for the amount of consistency we're able to pull with some of these specs. But overall, gotta say, really enjoying these Unholy DK changes, and I can't wait to actually see the Frost DK changes in the future. So let me know down in the comments below if you're excited to try out these changes if they make it to live. Obviously, some of the things could be changing within the future. So leave a like on this video if you enjoyed this video. Comment down below if you have any questions or builds you want me to try out for Unholy DK. Subscribe if you want some more DK content. And until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.